So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for the Sadhguru Center Speaker Series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Sadhguru Center for a Conscious Planet is a multidisciplinary research center based at the Department of Anesthesia, Critical Care, and Pain Medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Our mission is to weave together science and spiritual wisdom through research, education, and outreach. And we aim to do this through bringing the tools of well-being to both patients and healthcare providers to enhance consciousness, cognition, and compassion. We also offer wellness programs, conduct scientific studies in various communities, and we bring together world leaders from diverse fields to collaborate and innovate health and well-being solutions. So our speaker series presentation today is on mysticism and modern science that's being presented by Jonathan Dinsmore, who is currently an MS candidate in psychological science. He's also a researcher and instructor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. His research is mainly in the area of mystical and near-death experiences, with a current focus on a mixed methods investigation of mystical light experience as a measurable psychological construct. And thank you so much for joining us today, Jonathan. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Yeah. And thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to giving this presentation. So as you said, I'm a graduate researcher at UTC, and I'm working with Dr. Ralph Hood, who created the original mysticism scale, and it's been an honor to work with him. And yeah, so let's just get into it. So I made this presentation to be about 45 minutes. I actually have more slides than I have minutes to go. So the way I'm gonna do this is I'm gonna hit everything at a very high level. I'm not gonna cover every detail that's in the slides. And that way it's recorded for YouTube, right? So people can pause and then read the details in the slides if they want to. Okay. All right, so mysticism and modern science. So let's start out talking about just what is even mysticism. Mysticism is a word that people often use in a very vague way. It could be anything vaguely paranormal or strange, like you saw a ghost, maybe that's mystical. So people in popular culture use this term in a variety of ways, but in academia and in the sciences, we have a much more specific meaning for the term mysticism. And this term originates in Greek, and it was originally referred to initiates in schools of mystery. So it was referring to like the secrets of religion, the hidden mysteries of religion, even in its original term. And that sort of resonates with how we use it today as well. So some of the historical developments that led up to our modern scientific concept of mysticism has to do with, in psychology, particularly William James. He really pioneered the concept of mysticism as a universal experience that occurs in a variety of contexts and cultures. And this is also connected to the idea of perennialism. Perennialism is the idea that basically there's a universal experience behind religion, behind various spiritual traditions that inform them, and that explains the similarity of them. And so, in particular, mystical perennialism is that what we now identify as the mystical experience is that universal experience behind different religions and spiritual traditions. This was heavily popularized by Aldous Huxley, who wrote the perennial philosophy. And interestingly, he combined his experiences with psychedelics, in particular mescaline, with things that he had learned from Advaita Vedanta from Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda of the Vedanta Society had been traveling in the US and sort of propounding the Vedantic philosophy. And so he actually encountered that. So this combination of Eastern ideas and his psychedelic experiences really informed that. And then he popularized this, but it, obviously it wasn't just him, but he really heavily popularized it. But I think it's important at this point to acknowledge that this is not a new idea. So in the West, in the Western tradition, we've sort of rediscovered this idea after, our world being run by the Catholic Church for many hundreds of years. But this is not at all a new idea. It's essentially something that has existed in various forms throughout history. And so we have here some examples. In particular, I would say we're really indebted to the Indic traditions in particular for maintaining this sort of notion. And much of the Western rediscovery of this idea came actually from their contact with India as, colonialism expanded and all those sorts of things. So here we have a few different individuals, significant spiritual, religious figures expressing ideas either related to the mystical worldview or to the idea that there is a perennial mystical truth that is expressed in various cultures in various ways. So let's talk about some terminology. So really, when we talk about mysticism, what we're mostly talking about is the mystical experience. But just to differentiate these things a little bit, so mystical experience is characterized by an experience of unity, unity with God or the absolute, or a unity with the world as well. So we're going to go into more detail on the details of that, but this is the essential defining characteristic, is an experience of unity. Okay, and then mysticism, in the broader sense, at least in the academic sense, more broadly speaking, is all of the sort of cultural accoutrement around the mystical experience, you could say. So the practices, the discourses, the teachings, the groups, organizations that are all based around this experience and that generally are designed to hopefully provide a structure that will guide people towards this experience, and also who propound the worldview that tends to come from this experience, a worldview of what we would today in colloquial language just call oneness or unity, okay? But it's important to note that throughout the history, particularly as we've encountered this concept in the Western tradition, there have always been people who have felt that the mystical experience was somehow regressive or pathological, could have a pathological explanation, or could be a misattribution, and these kinds of things. So these are just a few examples. Freud felt that it was a regression to an infantile state. Durkheim felt that it was a misattribution and that actually they were feeling a unity with society because, sociology. Psychiatrists, psychiatric organizations have considered it to be somehow pathological, different ideas about how that might be. Persinger hypothesized that it was due to temporal lobe epilepsy. There are reasons to think that's not the case, but this is just to illustrate that all along the way, throughout the history of the concept of mysticism coming through the Western tradition into scientific study, it's always had people mostly wedded to the materialist worldview who want to say, somehow this is not legitimate, somehow it's pathological, or something like that. So the modern concept of mysticism that we now have comes from what we refer to as the Common Core model. It comes from the tradition of William James and through Walter Stace, a philosopher, who what Walter Stace did was that he said, the mystical experience is not some woozy, vague notion. No, it is a specific experience. We can say it has this structure, it has these categories, and we can make it something very clearly defined. And then through that to Ralph Hood, my advisor, who then took the work of Stace, the theoretical development of the concept from Stace, and then operationalized it and created a scale to measure it, and really was able to find in using that scale in the empirical evidence that no, this experience with this structure is in fact an experience that people have in a variety of cultures, and that we can measure it, and it does show up in the data. But there have along the way also been these critics and diversity theorists who have disagreed with this concept. And so this is mostly to do with religious studies and psychology of religion. It's related to the concept of constructivism. But basically, there are people who have always wanted to say, no, it's culturally contextual, maybe even socially constructed. Like some people even want to say that the experience itself is socially constructed and it's not a universal experience. But that is just a sort of an additional tradition that has sort of criticized the concept all along the way. But the Common Core theory is the lineage that has led to our scientific concept of mysticism. Okay, so this is just going a little bit more into detail on that sort of dichotomy between the constructivists and the perennialists. So I think a good metaphor is the heart attack. You may or may not be aware that there are various cultural concepts of what a heart attack is, particularly in pre-scientific cultures. So there are various cultures who have an idea that, for instance, that when a heart attack happens, there's some kind of wind coming into your body, and they have a whole idea about how that occurs. I don't claim to know too much detail about it, but in the same sense, we now recognize that a heart attack is something that we can clearly define, we can measure, it has these qualities, and it happens all over the world, no matter how people interpret it in their culture. And so just to keep this at a surface level and not to get too deep in the philosophical weeds, basically, this is the same concept with mysticism. We say, no, there is this experience, we can clearly define it, we can measure it, we call it mystical experience, It is a real thing that happens in different cultures. And yes, people interpret it in different ways in different cultures, but it is a single experience that we can clearly define and measure. All right, so this is the Common Core theory in a nutshell. And so this is one of the fundamental dichotomies between types of mystical experience. So we're expanding our mystical vocabulary here. Okay, so extrovertive versus introvertive. So one of the earliest things noted by Stace is that there was this dichotomy. And so the extrovertive mystical experience is an experience where the individual still perceives the world. The outer world is still present in the person's experience, but this world is experienced to be unified in a way that defines explanation, but somehow they have this powerful sense that the world is unified and that their self is unified with the world. And even the perception that often that there is a subjective quality in the world, or in other words, that the world itself is somehow conscious, and that there's no real differentiation between themselves, their own consciousness, and the consciousness that is present throughout the world. Now, this is as opposed to the introvertive mystical experience. So this is unity without world. So this is an experience in which someone has no mental content, has no perceptions of their outer world. It is an experience of pure subjectivity. And it is, in many people's minds, considered to be the deeper of the two, like a more profound, more central mystical experience. People debate that, but essentially the concept is there's no mental content. It is pure subjectivity, okay? So we have extrovertive, out in the world, unity out in the world, and then this sort of internal, you might say, or contentless experience of unity. Fundamental dichotomy between two different types of mystical experience. Here are some other qualities that mystical experience tends to have, okay? So ineffability, the inability to put it into words or concepts. Subjectivity, an inner subjective aspect to all things. Noetic, that it tells you something true about reality. It somehow conveys true knowledge to you about this unitive nature of all reality. Positive affect, extreme joy, bliss, love, etc. Ego loss, you're losing your sense of self, and timelessness and spacelessness. Okay, so let's get into the early studies of mysticism and mystical experience. So very early on, we had figures like Richard Buck, a psychiatrist who had a mystical experience of his own, and he compared his mystical experience to that of various religious figures throughout history. And he theorized that humanity's consciousness was evolving to a future state of consciousness for all of humanity, referred to as cosmic consciousness. And he believed that people who had had this experience had sort of taken this next step in evolution. William James, as I already mentioned, very significant figure in early psychology, wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, and he talked about a lot of different types of religious experience, but many of them would qualify as what we today would refer to as mystical, and he did refer to them in that manner and sort of pioneered the concept of this universal mystical experience within psychology. Walter Stace, who I've already mentioned, the philosopher who sort of concretized the more vague notion of mystical experience to a very specific thing. So introvertive and extrovertive. And then, so this is his model of mysticism. And also he determined that it had these interpretive elements as well. So a person might have religious interpretations of the experience, but there's this core experience which people interpret in different ways, perhaps depending on their religion. So there were these early findings where people were trying to measure mystical experience, trying to begin to use psychological methods to study mystical experience, but they were all really imprecise. They weren't based on the clear conceptual model provided by Stace. And so they were limited in various ways, and not all of them could even be said to be about mystical experience as we would define it in the Common Core model. So I'm not going to go into them in detail, but they were based on surveys where this question was asked about a vaguely religious type of experience being lifted up out of yourself by a higher power, these kinds of things, which might vaguely correlate to mystical experience as we would know it now, but are not really, not up to the task of really measuring the phenomenon. Okay, enter Ralph Hood. Dr. Hood is a psychologist who studies mysticism and psychology of religion more generally, and he was particularly inspired by James and Stace, and so he worked in mysticism research and developed, for instance, he began to develop methods to attempt to measure it in a more scientifically rigorous way. So, for instance, he developed an earlier attempt was the religious experience episodes measure, where they actually took examples from William James and asked respondents in surveys to rate the degree to which which their experience was similar to these experiences that were described by William James. So this is like an early example of trying to measure mystical experience. And he also studied it in various other ways. He studied voice stress among those who were acknowledging whether they had the experience and how it related to how they conceptualized their similarity in descriptions of mystical experience and eroticism. But really the big momentous occurrence in terms of the scientific study of mysticism was the development of the Hood mysticism scale. And so this was the first scale to clearly define and demarcate mystical experience according to the criteria laid down by Stace, and to prove, in a sense, that it is a real phenomenon. Because once this measure was created, then it could be tested in different populations, and by looking at the factor structure and other factors, we could say that it is in fact a single experience that's happening in these different cultures. So this was a major step for the scientific study of mysticism. And this has been translated into many different languages at this point, because this was in 1975 that he did this. And it's sometimes referred to as the HMS or the M scale. And it's been validated in many other cultures. So here are some items from the M scale, just to give you an idea of how we're measuring mystical experience. So I've had an experience that cannot be expressed in words, that ultimate reality was revealed to me, a oneness of myself with all things, in which I seem to be conscious, in which all things seem to be conscious. I had no sense of time or space, etc. So you can see that if someone endorses these items, clearly they have had the type of experience that Stace was talking about, that James was talking about. So it's fairly clear, fairly straightforward that they are measuring that type of experience. And indeed, that bears out in the data. So this is the Hood model. It's very similar to the Stace model. I don't think it's necessary to point out the differences. Very similar. The differences come from examination of the factor structure in the data. Okay, so after the Hood mysticism scale was developed, various studies in psychology of religion, for the most part, and for the most part with correlational methods, were used to study mystical experience. And these had some interesting findings, you know, that personality correlates with mystical experience, increase of reports in certain situations, like in moderately stressful activities in nature, like rock climbing and rappelling. People reported some, you know, some degree of higher mysticism scores, like they had a somewhat mystical experience. So, you know, some interesting findings here. And one particularly interesting, is relevant to the question of whether this is pathological, is they compared psychiatric inpatients with senior members of contemplative or mystical groups, who we could just kind of call mystics, and a control group. And what they found was that both the psychiatric patients and the mystics scored higher on the mysticism scale. So there is some tendency for mystical experience to occur among psychiatric patients, specifically with notably religious oriented symptoms. But the main difference that differentiated these two groups was that the psychiatric patients indicated had personality scores that indicated resistance and rigidity, whereas the mystics had personality scores that indicated a kind of openness and fluidity. So this is kind of an interesting early finding, indicating that you know, yeah, there's some kind of crossover with psychiatric conditions and things like that, as was later asserted by Persinger, etc. But it's not necessarily you know, definitive. Okay, so speaking of Persinger, let's talk very briefly about the God helmet experiments. This is something that is brought up often in relation to mystical experience and in relation to sort of religious experiences in general. So Persinger, basically what he did was he had this helmet that applied a weak magnetic field to the temporal area of the brain. And this was an attempt to demonstrate his hypothesis, or to support his hypothesis, that temporal lobe epilepsy was an explanation for mystical experience, and claimed to have produced mystical experience. Although it seems that in his papers, he's referring to mystical experience in a much more vague way, not really referring to it in the sense that we think of it in terms of the Common Core model. He's sort of saying vaguely a paranormal sense of a higher power or something. He's not really talking about the very specific religious experience or mystical experience that we talk about in the Common Core theory, and that the Hood mysticism scale measures. But this was failed to be replicated by Gronqvist and colleagues and other studies as well. And also they pointed out various criticisms of this study. The magnetic field that the helmet applies to the temporal area of the brain is 1,000,000 times weaker than transcranial magnetic stimulation, which for anyone who doesn't know, that's application of magnetic fields to the brain for therapeutic purposes. And they are able to cause changes in brain activity using magnetic fields, but those are 1,000,000 times stronger than the ones used here. So there's really not very compelling reason to think that a magnetic field that weak even would produce brain changes. And also the Gronqvist research found that the most significant predictors were actually suggestibility and a new age lifestyle. So it seemed that there are personality variables and individual differences that have very little to do with the temporal lobe that seemingly were able to better predict mystical experience in these conditions, which was basically wearing this helmet in a dark room and kind of sensory deprivation conditions. So Persinger and his group maintain that they are able to produce these experiences, but it's highly contested. But even if it were the case, that you were doing this magnetic stimulation of the temporal lobe and producing mystical experiences, this kind of misses a fundamental philosophical point, which is that it's a foregone conclusion that brain differences correlate to mystical experience. There's no question about that, especially from the psychedelic research, which we're going to talk a lot about. But obviously with psychedelics, people are taking a psychedelic and it's causing brain changes, and that causes mystical experiences. So it's a foregone conclusion that brain changes correlate to mystical experiences. So even if this were the case, it's not really proving anything, and it's kind of inconsequential. And if you would like to, if for anybody who would like to delve further into that question and just the question of whether mystical experiences should be taken seriously scientifically, if they have real implications, if we should think that the mystical worldview that they seem to imply, if it could have any implications for our worldview, this is an excellent book, highly recommended reading, Papa Nicolau. It is a scientific assessment of the validity of mystical experiences. It was recommended to me by Dr. Hood, and I just can't recommend it highly enough. It's a thin book, but tightly packed with really in-depth scientific assessment of the phenomenon. So highly recommended. Okay, so let's talk about the psychedelic studies. This is really where the rubber hits the road, you guys, because essentially, all of the other stuff that's happened so far has been really interesting. It was extremely significant to be able to measure it with Dr. Hood's measure. But really, I think it's safe to say that the most profound results that we've achieved in terms of the scientific study of mysticism have occurred with psychedelics, because psychedelics just produce really intense experiences and really intense mystical experiences relatively reliably. I mean, it's like a pill for mystical experiences, essentially. So there's just no way that you can talk about the science of mysticism without talking at length about psychedelic research. So the earliest psychedelic study of mysticism was the Good Friday experiment. This was at least measuring it in a measurable way. So this is Walter Pankey in 1962. And this is the most famous experiment, early experiment of looking at the psychedelics' ability to produce mystical experiences. And so this was 10 out of 20, the other 10 being a control group, Harvard divinity students. So these were people going to school to be ministers who were administered psilocybin in a Good Friday service. So they were at church. Okay, and it was a randomized, controlled, double-blind experiment. Although the blinding doesn't last long in psychedelic research, because pretty soon it becomes clear who got the psychedelic. So anyway, Pankey, he used instruments of his own design. So these were not like validated instruments. This was before the Hood scale. So he used instruments of his own design to try to measure mystical experience. But he did find significant differences in psilocybin versus controls in mystical experience results. And so at the long-term follow-up, the subjects unanimously said that it was an extremely significant experience to them, and it was one of the high points of their spiritual life. Okay. But really, the really landmark studies, you could say, sort of before and after mysticism research, before Johns Hopkins and after Johns Hopkins. So the Johns Hopkins studies with psilocybin, specifically looking at mystical experience, the psilocybin's ability to produce mystical experiences, has been probably the most significant research that's ever been done in terms of mystical experience. So we're going to spend some time talking about it. So they were specifically focused, there's been lots of psychedelic research, but the Johns Hopkins group was specifically focused on the ability to produce mystical experience and how mystical experience may relate to various positive outcomes. This is landmark research. And they did use Hood scale, and they also developed an additional existing scale. I believe they revamped it a bit, the mystical experience questionnaire. So they actually used Hood scale to validate the mystical experience questionnaire. So the design of this study was essentially that there was, so participants were 36. So all the psychedelic studies have fairly low samples. That's just a byproduct of the way that it's early on and being able to study these things. Think about it. These things were banned. Psychedelic research was banned for 30 years about. So it's really a pretty huge deal that in the 2000s going forward, we've been able to research these things. So the dose was significant, 30 milligrams. That's close to 5 dried grams of mushrooms. So for anybody who understands the dosage of mushrooms, that is a substantial dose. Okay, so it's believable that they had a mystical experience on a dose like that. Also, this was in a controlled clinical setting, so therapists were there to provide support, and also a medical doctor, and there was even preparation sessions. And really, one of the things that sets this research apart is that they took a lot of precautions. They screened out anybody who had a family history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So they really did it right. They did it very safely in a very controlled, safe environment. And participants were given a blindfold and encouraged to go inward. And they had headphones to listen to music. So they were encouraged to have an inward experience. Okay. Now, this design is a double blind between groups crossover design. And so what this means is there were 2 groups. And one group got methylphenidate, which is an ADHD medication, and that just serves as a kind of control because it has some psychoactive properties, but is not anything like psilocybin. And so in the first time point, this was randomly assigned, of course, and the control group and the psilocybin group got their doses. And then at the second time point, it was switched. So this allowed to control for expectancy effects in an ethical way. So the participants knew they would get the psilocybin at some point. And also it allowed all of the participants to have the psilocybin experience, which is of course why they were participating. They were curious about the experience, but they were all hallucinogen naive, by the way. So we see that there were significant results from this study. Okay, so the majority of the participants said it was either the single most or top 5 most personally meaningful experience of their life. So people equated it to the birth of a child or the death of a loved one, like highly, highly significant experiences. And of course, here we see on the mysticism scale, drastic differences between the methylphenidate group and the psilocybin group, okay? So very clear that there's an effect here. So we also see mysticism scores correlating to measure of spiritual significance. So they have a questionnaire related to the spiritual significance. And also in terms of the drug effect, so the self-reported drug effect, actually very little correlation. So the mystical experience is much more important for the personal significance than is just the raw intensity of the drug effect. So again, just similar results here showing, for instance, positive behavior changes at follow-up correlated highly with psilocybin. Okay, so all of this is very, very significant findings, just showing that, yes, there's a profound effect with the psilocybin. Here are some of the experiences that people described. A non-self held suspended in an almost tactile field of light. The collapse of ordinary space and time, realization of unity of existence and relativity of ordinary consciousness. A feeling of no boundaries. I didn't know where I ended and where my surroundings began. Okay, again, clearly this lines up perfectly with the Common Core Stace Hood model of mystical experience. So, and it's obvious from their descriptions that that is exactly what they're experiencing. Now, significantly, in another study, this drastic reductions to anxiety and depression measures. And this is among people who had terminal illness. I believe it was cancer. And so as you can see in all of these, I mean, it just goes crashing down after having these psilocybin. So, mystical experience was judged to be extremely, important in this, but it's just, it's important to see that, I mean, these are amazing from a clinical perspective. You might expect to see a change like this with really consistent therapy and traditional treatments over a course of years. And this happened practically overnight. Mystical experience here, as you can see, personal meaningfulness, spiritual significance, again, just highly correlated. And this is at the follow-up. This is for the cancer patients, and also a negative correlation with the depression and anxiety. So mystical experience specifically predicts these things. And also, so here we go. Mystical experience predicting all of these outcomes. Of course, I can't go over these, but these are all significant findings, okay? Significant changes to the outcomes, and mystical experience explaining them, okay? Explaining these changes. And then even when you control for the self-reported intensity of the experience, you still have, in many of these, highly significant findings. So controlling for statistically the intensity. So even if you put the intensity of the experience aside as a contributing factor, the mystical experience is still highly predictive of many of these outcome variables. So they also tested a mediation model. So for those who aren't familiar, a mediation model means, in this case, psychedelic dose affects these various outcome variables via mystical experience. So it's not direct, but because it causes mystical experience, this is the causal arrow, right? So because it causes mystical experience, it then causes these changes to these outcome variables. And these are the outcome variables that were implicated in the mediation model. So meaningfulness, spiritual significance, life satisfaction, anxiety, depression, total, and another measure of anxiety. Here's the MEQ30, just for a brief kind of review. This is an alternative measure of mystical experience, and it's designed to refer to a specific mystical experience, whereas Hood's scale measures lifetime mystical experience. It says, have you ever had this type of experience and this type of experience? In the MEQ, it's in this particular experience, did you have feeling that you experienced eternity or infinity, an experience of being pure awareness, etc. So these are just example items. Okay, another study which combined psilocybin with spiritual practice, including meditation and journaling. Okay, and so they had a low dose group with standard support for spiritual practice, a high dose group with standard support for spiritual practice, and a high dose group with high support for spiritual practice. And this included meditation, instructions on meditation, even involved mantra meditation, and journaling instructions on how to do all those things. And again, we see significant effects. And in general, the takeaway from this study is that mystical experience is the most significant factor, but the spiritual practice and the support for the spiritual practice did have an effect. It definitely enhanced the effect of the mystical experience. But statistically, the mystical experience was the primary factor that explained the variance in the outcome variables. And so finally, we have some work that has to do with putting together a lot of the neuroscience findings that have come out, because people have started to scan people's brains on psychedelics. And so there seems to be a correlation between the mystical experience and the shutting down of the default mode network. And so this is really the model that psychedelic science seems to be converging on for an explanation of mystical experience. And so it has to do with shutting down this network. What does this network do? Well, let's look at some of the functions that this network does. So self-referential processing, mentalizing, self-judgments, internal dialogue, autobiographical memory retrieval. These are all things that you would associate with your sense of self and how you operate in the world with a sense of self. So it makes perfect sense that these things, this network, would be shutting down when you are experiencing a state in which you have ego dissolution, in which you have no self, in which you merge with reality or with the absolute or God, however you conceive of that. And here are some images of similarities between psilocybin and the default mode network shutting down, and also during meditation with the default mode network shutting down. So similarities we're seeing between the psilocybin mystical experience and also in meditation. Okay, so this is just one group who has focused specifically on mystical experience, but there are many other studies that have looked at mystical experience as a factor as they researched psychedelics. So I can't cover them all. Here are a few others, at least to start you on reading further about this if you want to delve into the literature. Additionally, here are some interesting findings about the increased brain interconnectivity on psychedelics. Now, the authors here do not go so far as to say that this is connected with mystical experience, but they do suppose that it could be connected to various synesthesias that occur with psychedelics, but it's possible that it could also be related to mystical experience as well. And so we see this much greater interconnectivity of the different brain regions as represented by the controls on the left and the psychedelic subjects on the right. So much of this psychedelic brain research is coming out of Imperial College London, and this is a team led by Carhart Harris, and it's the Center for Psychedelic Research. Now, this group seems not to be too fond of the concept of mystical experience. They're sort of in the camp that wants to kind of divorce the concept from any sort of mystical implications, so any sort of implications about something transcendent, but they have done a lot of this brains research with psychedelics that has been significant, and they hypothesize that perhaps shutting down the default mode network, well, they think that the default mode network represents a more evolved form of cognition, and that shutting it down may relate to a regression to a more primary or basic mode of functioning. It's a theory. It's not a theory that, I'm not a neuroscientist, but it's not particularly my line of thinking, but it is what their model is. But an alternative take on the shutting down of the default mode network is written by Dr. Woolacott and Shumway Cook. So this is a theory. She's a neuroscientist, someone I know personally, a wonderful person. And she is theorized that they theorize that the shutting down of the default mode network could actually be the reduction of a filter, which keeps out a higher consciousness. So this is an idea that goes back to William James. William James put forward the idea that perhaps the brain is filtering consciousness in some way. And so in religious experiences, in these types of experiences, perhaps this filter is released somehow. And then the flood of religious experience or mystical experience is related to a reduction of the filtering mechanism. And the concept that the brain filters out information is not necessarily controversial in neuroscience, but the idea that it's filtering out transcendental information, of course, would be in mainstream neuroscience. So other modern studies and developments. So outside of just psychedelic research, what else has been going on in mysticism research? So there's been an MRI study of Carmelite nuns. Okay, this one's kind of funny because the Carmelite nuns said God cannot be summoned at will. So they were sort of had that quip to say. But anyway, they tried to summon God at will. So they put these nuns into a fMRI machine. And what they found was modest scores on the mysticism scale, but they found activation in areas that had to do with emotion, spatial perception, so perhaps some sense of expansiveness of the concept of self and having to do with spatial perception, and visual imagery. And what they subjectively described feeling in those MRI machines was a presence of God, the unconditional and infinite love of God, and a plenitude and peace, a sense of plenitude and peace. So a small study, fMRI, but interesting because they scanned the brains of people having some degree of mystical experience outside of a psychedelic context. Now, I also research near-death experiences, and so Bruce Grayson is the world's leading expert in near-death experiences. He has the most publications on the topic. He's over at the University of Virginia, and he did a study, excuse me, I'm gonna drink something. He did a study where he looked at applying the mysticism scale and the NDE scale together to a population of NDE experiencers. And what he found was that there was quite a bit of overlap between the two constructs. So many near-death experiences are to varying degrees having mystical experiences or experiences that register on the mysticism scale. And so this is very interesting. 60% had a full-on mystical experience, past the threshold for that. 27% in between. So, and the two scales correlated at 0.54, which is a fairly moderate to strong correlation. Okay, another study briefly that looked at meditation retreats, so meditators. And so they were looking at the cognitive factors that variables that would predict mystical experiences among meditators at a 3-day retreat. And what they found was that a state of surrender was a key predictor, and that furthermore, trait absorption and low mental barriers also contributed. And so absorption is something that we've already seen, I believe, with the Persinger research. Trait absorption, suggestibility, things that are related to hypnotic suggestibility, these things have been shown to also correlate. But absorption particularly is the ability to be absorbed in any given stimulus or activity. And so this, of course, you would expect this to some degree to correlate to meditation experience. And also it has been shown to be a predictor of mystical experience among meditators. But surrender being the most important, that's a very interesting factor. There's been one study with the Isha Yoga meditators, experienced Isha Yoga meditators, and it was investigating a relationship between, again, these types of traits that might predict the incidence of mystical experience. And trait absorption, we already saw that, mentalizing, so the ability to think about your thoughts and to think about others' thoughts, and meditation practice, just the length and duration of practice. And they did find that absorption, mentalizing, and regular meditation all together in hierarchical regression were highly predictive of mystical experience. So another interesting finding, and one that has to do with the Isha Yoga organization as well. So here it's worthwhile to mention, I think, that there are some shifting conceptualizations of mystical experience in some quarters of the research of the field. So, for instance, there are certain researchers looking at perhaps broader concepts like self-transcendent experiences. Dr. Yaden, whose picture is here on the right. So self-transcendent experiences, transcendence of the self, it's related to mystical experience, but it could perhaps encompass more experiences than just what would strictly be considered a mystical experience, according to the Hood model, Stace model. Cason has introduced the concept of spiritually transformative experiences, and this again encompasses more. It encompasses anything that has a spiritually transformative effect, commonly near-death experiences, mystical experiences, psilocybin, psychedelic experiences, Kundalini awakening experiences is a category that they put in there. And then you have others who are looking at sort of demystifying the concept of mysticism. This is going back to the people at Imperial College London, Carhart Harris, for instance, trying to change the construct, change the nature of the construct to something that has less religious or spiritual implications or associations. So for instance, the concept of oceanic boundlessness. So it's kind of saying the same thing, but without any spiritual interpretation. A sense of oceanic boundless experience, so dissolving of the self, merging, and then also an ego dissolution inventory introduced by another researcher named Noor. And so this is similar, ego dissolution being the dissolving of the sense of self. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about paths forward and the various challenges that exist in the field. Okay, so a big challenge that exists in the field is resistance, ideological resistance to studying the concept of mysticism. So an example of this is a publication that came out, an article that came out called Moving Past Mysticism in Psychedelic Science. And in this, they essentially argued that we really, if we're going to be good scientists, we need to get away from all of these concepts related to, sort of woo-woo concepts of spirituality, and all these things. Like we really need to make sure that we're being completely secular. And they actually said that in some of these quotes explicitly, like we need to make sure that it is secular, unambiguously secular. There it is. So an obstacle to studying mysticism is just ideological resistance to the very concept of mysticism itself and how it can be significant to people and how it can be significantly predictive of positive outcomes, which has been well demonstrated, especially in the psychedelic research. Okay, so that's a problem. But then you have resistance to the resistance. So they actually wrote a sort of rebuttal piece or a response called Working with Weirdness, a response to Moving Past Mysticism. And so they argue that, it doesn't make sense to dismiss mystical experience or the construct of mysticism basically just because you think it sounds woo-woo. It's a straw man argument because you're talking about it as if it's something that is not empirically studied and well defined from an empirical perspective, but actually it is. And so you see that there's not only resistance to mysticism as a construct, but also resistance to the resistance. So we have this kind of divergence that seems to be happening where some people are willing to embrace the sort of strangeness of the experience, and others are like, whoa, no, we need to keep this along the lines of our ideology, essentially. Within a physicalist model, you could say. Okay, so again, we have more of these, somebody saying that subjective effects of psychedelics may not be necessary. So this is actually an argument that maybe it doesn't matter the subjective effects. Maybe if somebody just took a psilocybin pill but didn't have any crazy internal experiences, maybe it would still be therapeutic, which is kind of laughable to anybody who's taken psychedelics or who understands the literature even. But nevertheless, this is an argument that's being made. And the Griffiths and Yaden team at Johns Hopkins, Yaden is also at Johns Hopkins, they came back and said, well, you know what, we really don't think that's the case, but we would concede that that's the case if you administer psilocybin to somebody under anesthesia, and if they still have these therapeutic effects to the same degree, then okay, we'll concede that the subjective effects are just a side effect and it doesn't matter. But highly doubtful, highly doubtful. And another indication that this is highly doubtful is a a thematic synthesis. So a thematic synthesis, for those of you who are not familiar with qualitative research, is where you take multiple qualitative studies. It's kind of like a meta-analysis in quantitative research. So you take multiple qualitative studies and you combine them. And this is very important, especially in qualitative research, because qualitative samples are always very small. And so combining, aggregating the findings from multiple qualitative studies can provide them with more, evidential power. And so in this one, what they found was that among psychedelic therapy recipients, they asked them why psychedelic therapy was superior to the traditional therapeutic methods that they had already done, things like cognitive behavioral therapy. And these 5 themes were what emerged: insights, seeing hidden causes of problems, of their mental health problems, altered self-perception, and particularly an expanded self, feelings of connectedness, no longer a discrete world of disconnected objects, transcendental experiences, including mystical experience, and just a general connection to something transcendent, and an expanded emotional spectrum, so mostly a greater ability to love and to feel in general. So these are indicative, of course, that in their own words, in the participants' own words, that the subjective effects are extremely significant. And as well, this is my personal speculation, this may have etiological implications. Think about it. If these 5 things are the things that are helpful, that help to overcome mental health difficulties, then what does that say potentially about the causal role of the opposite of these things in mental health difficulties? If psychedelics are so profoundly helpful because they do these things, does that tell us that the opposite of these things are part of the problem? For instance, perceiving the world as a discrete world of disconnected objects? Is it possible that in some way that is not easily approached scientifically, that perceiving oneself to be in a world of disconnected objects actually has an effect on mental health, a negative effect on mental health, and disconnection from something transcendent is not having a connection to something transcendent? Could that have an etiological causal implication in mental health? I mean, I think that's a question that we should ask. And Dr. Hood, in more recent work, has argued from a theoretical standpoint that psychology does not need to be limited to the naturalist assumptions or the physicalist or materialist assumptions. Spiritual worldviews or psychologies can be scientific, and psychological science can be spiritual or theistic. We can have groups of psychological scientists who do come from a spiritual background and worldview, and they don't have to pretend to be materialist. There is no reason why theories based on spiritual, theistic, or similar worldviews cannot make predictions which could be tested. So this whole idea that spiritual things and concepts have to be separate from science, according to Dr. Hood, and I would agree with him, is not a necessary distinction. We have various other thinkers and academics, scholars, scientists who have provided us with various reasons for thinking additionally that the physicalist model may not be sufficient, and that there may be reason to think that the mystical worldview is could some real implications, and that it's not that hard to believe that the world may be unified, or that there may be even ideas like consciousness may be fundamental to reality. These are ideas that are being tossed around in the intellectual sphere. It's not totally fringe. It's not as fringe as it used to be. Okay, so lastly, just some considerations for moving forward. I think that it's extremely important to use mixed methods and also just to have an attitude of pluralism and pragmatism. So the reason for this is with any phenomenon that is difficult to access from scientific methods, it doesn't make sense to restrict ourselves to say only what matters is the large scale random control trials. I think we have to take a variety of approaches and get the information that we can get about the experience in a variety of ways. And also there's something that I'm calling the Procrustean razor fallacy, which I sort of humorously trademarked here, which is, I'm going to write a paper about it. I just haven't done it yet. But essentially, it is problematic ways in which we exclude aspects of the phenomenon as it presents itself, the data itself, in order to fit it into our pathological explanatory models. And I think that from a scientific perspective, that's very problematic. And so something to consider in moving forward with these things. Last slide here. We have, in some sense, a fork in the road. So, as with some individuals, some schools of thought in the field, we have. All right. So in some in the field are taking a more reductive path, want to ignore the transcendental significance of the experience, explain it purely pathologically, regressively, reductively in various ways, and to somehow say, oh no, this is just the brain doing something wonky, and that's it. And then we have the other option, which is to approach it more open, in a more open way, acknowledge the meaningfulness and potentially even the transcendental implications of the experiences that we're studying. And to really be open-minded about and not committed to a physicalist paradigm. And so that's all I got. That is my presentation, and I'm open for questions. Thank you. That's my sources.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that really interesting presentation. We'll now open the floor to any questions from our audience. You may raise your hand to be called on to ask your question, or you can also type your question in the chat as well.
Jonathan, this is fantastic, trying to combine the science and the mysticism, right? So what I wanted to quote was, and in my part, I'm paraphrasing Sadhguru here, that we call something as mystic until we don't know what that is, right? For example, flying through planes 300 years ago would have been considered mystic. So I think we're inching towards that and just totally discarding these experiences, because it's not just an experience, and after that the life changes in a better way, like you mentioned somewhere in your presentation, that you become more fluid, you're not rigid anymore, and that is self-explanatory. Like one experience that gets you and then moves you to that other plane where you're fluid and you're progressing and using your cognition. What about the other networks? You mentioned that the MRI scans actually show the stronger and long-range networks being established in these patients who had this experience, or meditators who have those experiences. They've shown in experienced meditators that network actually increases, the connectivity increases in them, especially the long-range connectivities that you talk about. So when people take the reductionist path, I just can't understand how they will explain all these things that are coming with it. I think Griffiths himself says that psychedelics is like a quick path to these experiences. Meditation is a true and tested model for getting to these experiences. And there are so many ways of meditation that can still get to the same place. I just can't really understand how a reductionist path can explain all these things. With that, I see a lot of people commenting there. I'll just leave that there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. Why don't we hear some of the other questions here?
So let me just look at the chat. There are some questions from the chat.
Oh, yeah. I should look. Okay.
Okay, Susan Holland is right there. So she can ask the question directly.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I didn't know what to expect, so I learned a lot. As you were speaking, I have a couple questions in the chat, but one of them that I'm very interested in is, have there been any studies of people who are present with, I would assume it's not a caregiver, because I think that we would hear more about that, like a nurse or a physician, but potentially sometimes that could happen, but somebody who's present with a loved one when they pass away of experiences of mysticism or reported those types of experiences.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm aware of some of those descriptions from near-death experiences specifically that you're referring to, where they have a particular experience just by virtue of being in proximity to someone who is going through the death process. As far as like the scientific work on that, I do believe it's not fresh on my mind at the moment, but I do believe I've seen at least a couple of studies where they mention that. As far as with psychedelics, I have heard like reports of that nature, but I haven't seen anything in the research in a scientific context to indicate that those kinds of things are going on. But once we open up the possibilities and start studying these things in more and more context, who knows what might show up? It's interesting to think about.
I think Sadhbir has a question. He can come on screen and ask his question.
Hi, great talk. Unfortunately, I'm unable to come on to screen, but my understanding is that some of the research that's trying to nail down the neuroscience about which parts of the brain are being activated during a mystical experience. I mean, some of the popular stuff came out in terms of the God particle and so on, and the God region of the brain, and is it now being more accepted that this experience is more likely the engagement of an actual network within the brain?
That's a great question. So most of the research that I'm aware of in relation to the neural correlates of mystical experience does have to do with the deactivation of the default mode network. And so that's really been the focus where that line of research has been converging on. But as far as the activations of other networks, it's possible that does exist in the research. I'm not a neuroscientist myself, so I review the neuroscience at a sort of higher level. And in terms of the gist of what they're saying, the main findings of what they're talking about seems to be the deactivation of the default mode network. But as we continue to study the psychedelic experience and mystical experience, I'm sure that, as with anything, you get more and more granular in what you look at. And I look forward to seeing what else comes out of that. And so it may be in particular, you said like the God area of the brain. That's interesting. That's actually something I'm not super familiar with. So I would be very interested to see if that is the case.
Yeah, you mentioned the default mode network. I mean, there's really intriguing studies now with meditation. Wendy Hassenkamp published her trial showing the different networks activated during the focus phase of meditation and when the mind slipped into mind wandering. And when the mind slipped into mind wandering, the DMN was activated.
Yeah.
Whereas when the meditator shifted into the focus phase, that was the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So you see that relationship in the default mode network already in meditation practice.
Yeah, and they even refer to the default mode network sometimes as the mind wandering network. And you can see why. I mean, sort of you're thinking about yourself, it sort of reinforces your ego concept. So I think it's all connected to the ego concept, what we referred to as the ego traditionally. I think the default mode network is very much the neural correlate of the ego, more or less. Maybe imprecise to say that, but I think you can look at it that way. And so it makes perfect sense that it would be getting deactivated in both meditation experiences and in mystical experiences with the psychedelics as well.
And also the correlation with the surrender as being one of the predictors of having these mystical experiences correlates exactly with the DMN shutdown too.
Yes, because you wouldn't be engaging in as much like rumination or anything, or default mode network also. Prefrontal cortex, is sort of coordinating self-control and like things like that as well. So if you just kind of surrendering, letting go, yeah, I could see that connection as well. Interesting.
This resistance is gone, and then you're fluid and you surrender, and your rumination is less, and you prepare to see things the way they are, which is what exactly the 7-day or 8-day intensive retreat actually is meant to be. That the practices that comes out of it is, can you see things the way they are instead of making up something in your own head?
Well, it's perfect then. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We should all try and be more fluid. What other questions we got?
Jonathan, can you comment on the respective contributions of the left and right hemispheres to the mystical experience, whether psilocybin induced or natural?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, you know, there's things like, for instance, in the Jill Bolte Taylor case where she had the shutdown of the left side of her brain, and a lot of what she described sounded very mystical, you know, like a losing.
That's what I was referring to partly.
Exactly. So yeah, that's what you're thinking of. Yes. So it's possible that, I mean, just the fact that there's an increase in interconnectivity between all areas of the brain, like as we saw with that graphic earlier, might indicate that there's less sort of division in the function, and so an increased just integration of the brain as a whole, which would mean that that right side being further integrated with everything else, like self-concept. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to say again that I'm not enough of a neuroscientist to really comment in detail on how this would relate, or how this relates in the existing literature on the brain with mystical experience. But I would like to know. That is a good question, because as you said, or yeah, as you were thinking, the Jill Bolte Taylor case does make you think that, or the case of the left side of the brain shutting down, resulting in very mystical kind of characteristics. So I would like to know as well what that relationship is.
So while we're waiting for others to ask, one other question I have is the use of the scale itself, the use of Hoods mysticism scale. And you mentioned the MEQ used by Griffiths for various reasons, varying situations. MEQ is more like a acute event and then follow that up with that, whereas HMS is like a long-term, long-range event. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the Hood mysticism scale is a lifetime measure. So basically it's the format of the scale. It asks if in your life you have ever experienced these particular types of experiences of unity, everything that it lists, like I gave those items in that slide. So essentially it's to study, people's experiences of that, which, is much, you could say it can be modified to study specific experiences. You can just say in the instructions, please answer this regarding this particular experience. And in fact, that is done sometimes in the research. But the MEQ30 was designed specifically to measure, it was originally designed for work with psychedelics. So it was originally designed to be specifically in reference to a certain experience that a person is going to go through, and then you want to reference back to that experience. But similarly, you could take the MEQ30 and just say, include instructions that say, but then with scales, there's a whole process of validation. And so there might be some question. You might want to do studies where you use the scale in that way and validate the fact that it can be used in that way by correlating it with other similar scales. But in principle, there's no reason, in my opinion, why you couldn't use the MEQ30 retroactively the way you'd normally use the Hood scale, or why you can't use the M scale in relation to specific experiences, as some people have already done. So it's just a difference in the way that scales are typically used and are meant to be used originally. But I think they can both be used both ways, just with minor changes.
Okay. Look in the chat box if there's anything more.
Hello.
Hi.
Can I speak? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I understand your whole paper, everything. Extrovert and introvert. I have all experience. The person who was talking about the God particles, when your pituitary gland is open, means you are getting the somaras. When you have a psychedelic substance, that is a different. But in meditation, when you go in samadhi completely, you get somaras, which is called as equal as you are completely in ecstasy. And that is the one that when your pituitary gland is open, do you think the person is getting gamma waves or waves?
So as far as the role of the pituitary gland, that's not something that from a scientific perspective is established necessarily. And I do hear people saying that. And I wouldn't say either way on that matter. But as to states of samadhi and whether it relates to gamma rays, again, I wouldn't be able to say. But there are differences in the wave patterns within the brain that have been observed. Gamma waves, alpha waves. So yes, indeed, there's alpha blocking that seems to occur, and also increases to gamma waves. Yes. And also in terms of samadhi, that's something that I'm personally really interested in, because people are described as, going into states where they are hardly even breathing. They hardly even have a heartbeat. I want to see what's going on in those people's brains.
I had a follow-up question on the Griffiths. Did he follow up of these patients after the experiments for a long term to see if their life changed, right? There is one psychologist who talks about that. But what else happened after the mystical experiences? Was there anything else, like long-term follow-up on them?
Yeah, they did long-term follow-ups with various measures, in particular with the psilocybin experiments. And they measured a lot of different things, positive outcomes, spirituality. So they have measures of spirituality. There are measures that look at how your life has changed since the experience. So the questions directly ask you, how your life has changed since the experience in this way, in that way, in that way, in that way, etc. And they found very significant findings, mostly positive outcomes that were significant. Reductions to anxiety and depression as well were lasting. So at the follow-ups, these are longitudinal studies. So at the follow-ups, basically the gist of the research as a whole is that at these follow-up points in time, the effects that you saw earlier after the experience did not drastically reduce. It was basically the same. So when they said it was extremely meaningful right after, they said it was extremely meaningful 14 months later. When they said that it was, the anxiety had reduced, the anxiety was still quite reduced 14 months later, etc. So yes, the changes seem to be lasting, which again is amazing from a therapeutic standpoint, that this experience can create these changes that are lasting, that with traditional therapeutic methods like cognitive behavioral therapy would take a long time, a lot of money, many sessions of talk therapy, and relying entirely on the rational mind. That's an interesting aspect of it. Cognitive behavioral therapy or traditional therapies relying entirely on the irrational mind ability to change one's thinking. Whereas this experience is you eat something that grows on a cow patty, essentially, and it relies not at all on the irrational mind, and it changes you practically overnight in extremely drastic ways. I mean, this is just such a major thing for the study of not just mystical experience, but psychology. It's hard to overstate how momentous of a discovery it is.
Thank you so much. And for our last question, Satbir, would you like to share?
Yeah. You're undoubtedly familiar with Csikszentmihalyi's flow construct. Has there been any research that's tied these two together? I know it's a little bit difficult to compare because flow is done during an activity, whereas the mystical state is just spontaneous, if you will.
Yeah, so flow states. So I don't believe I have seen any research connecting mysticism and flow states. So in my own research and my own review, it's possible that some does exist, and that's a really interesting question. I would like to see if there's not, somebody should study that. So mysticism research is still at, even though it's been going on for a while, 1975, in many ways, many things still haven't been explored because it's not a really widely researched area. But the psilocybin studies have sort of popularized it. And so maybe we'll see more and more studies connecting mystical experience to things like flow states. So that would be very interesting to see. Yeah.
Well, we actually did a study looking at 6-week yoga intervention from highly performing young adult musicians. And we measured flow state before and after the 6 weeks. And we found that those that practiced the yoga had an increase in the flow state, including the subscale of autotelic experience.
Oh.
And I also applied to that population, at least for one year out of the 3 years that we were doing the program, a pre-post version of Hood's mysticism scale,
You
asking.
did the study. Well, great.
Well, we didn't see any increase in scores.
Okay, I gotcha. I gotcha. Oh,
But it was a pre-post over the past 2 weeks, how much, and all of those 8 constructs were there. And actually Ralph Hood was kind enough to email that he thought that was a reasonable use of it. But in any case, we did not see improvements in that. But that would be interesting to see if we could do a pre-post version of the Hood's mysticism scale.
absolutely. Yeah. Reliably producing mystical experiences without psychedelics is a challenge in the field, a major challenge in the field. And some things have been shown to some degree, to a limited degree, but there's nothing quite like psychedelics to do it. So yeah, at least so far.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your presentation and for the Q&A. I know that we have gone over time. I'll just be sharing briefly a few more slides, and then we will wrap up today's event. So our upcoming speaker series will be on January 12th at 4 p.m. on the impact of mind-body therapies on behavioral changes by Gloria Ye, who is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the director of clinical research at the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine. It will take place online via Zoom, and she'll talk about studies that look at mindful movement and Tai Chi for promoting physical activity in chronic pulmonary patients. You may register for this event on Eventbrite through the link that is shared in the slide and also in the chat. Our center also offers different wellness programs for different clinical populations. Our long COVID breathing and wellness program is offered for free online, and it supports long COVID patients with their recovery and mental health. This program began last year with over 500 patients referred, and it's in collaboration with the Critical Illness and COVID-19 Survivorship Program here at the IDMC. We also have a cancer survivors quality of life program that's offered online and is in collaboration with the Cancer Center here, and a program supporting mental health in Parkinson's disease patients that's offered online, and it's in collaboration with the Parkinson's Disease and Movement Disorder Center at the IDMC. And finally, we offer personal wellness programs to support patients, providers, and professionals with meeting their wellness goals through one-on-one customized sessions that can be scheduled online or in person at our center here in Boston, Massachusetts. And you'll find the link to sign up for any of these programs on the Zoom chat below, or you can also visit our website on our program page. And we invite you to keep in touch with us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter or on LinkedIn for updates on our center. And finally, you can reach out to the Sadhguru Center anytime using this email and sign up for our mailing list to receive updates on our upcoming events using the QR code on the slide or also in the link shared in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us here today, and we hope to have you with us again.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for coming. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jonathan.